Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through the life of Harold Godwinson, the final Anglo-Saxon monarch to wear England's crown. This epic tale will softly guide you through his rise from nobleman to king, his brief but tumultuous reign, and his heroic yet tragic end at the Battle of Hastings, all designed to carry you gently toward restful sleep over the next 3 to 4 peaceful hours. I know many of you love these long-form documentaries for your nighttime routine, and I've noticed that our wonderful Sleepy Crown community has been a bit quiet in the comments lately. Please, I truly encourage you to share your thoughts. Tell me which part of Harold's dramatic story resonates with you most. What moments give you chills? Or simply let me know what time you're listening and from which corner of the world you're joining our sleepy family tonight. Your comments mean everything to me and help other listeners discover these peaceful historical journeys right now. As you settle in, whether it's 9 p.m., 11 p.m., or those precious late-night hours when sleep feels most elusive, take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying it so far. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have so many more soothing tales of kings, queens, and ancient civilizations waiting to lull you into the most restful sleep. I see some of you joining us live right now. Please don't be shy. Drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and what's brought you to Harold's story tonight. Whether you're a history enthusiast, someone seeking better sleep, or simply curious about England's last Saxon king, you're exactly where you belong. So cozy up under your softest blanket. Close your eyes and let these gentle whispers from the 11th century carry you through Harold's remarkable journey toward the most peaceful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to our growing Sleepy Crown family. Harold, later known as King Harold II of England, entered this world around the year 1022 in the ancient and storied kingdom of Wessex. Born into a family whose extraordinary destiny would become inextricably woven with the very fabric of English history itself, his birth occurred during one of the most tumultuous and transformative periods in all of medieval European civilization, when the ancient order of Anglo-Saxon England stood precariously balanced against the relentless and ever-growing tide of Scandinavian influence that had swept across the turbulent waters of the North Sea like a devastating winter storm, carrying with it the promise of both unprecedented opportunity and catastrophic destruction. The infant who would one day wear the sacred and ancient crown of England, bearing the weight of 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon tradition upon his shoulders, was the beloved son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, a man whose truly extraordinary political acumen, ruthless personal ambition, and masterful understanding of the complex dynamics of medieval power politics had elevated him from relatively modest and humble beginnings to become one of the most influential, feared, and respected figures in the entire realm of England. Godwin's remarkable and almost miraculous rise to the pinnacle of political prominence represented nothing short of a complete transformation of the established social order, achieving something that was virtually unprecedented in an age when noble birth and ancient bloodlines typically determined not only one's social position, but also the absolute ceiling of one's potential achievements and influence within the rigid, hierarchical structure of medieval society. From his origins as the devoted son of a Thane of Sussex, whose territorial holdings were certainly respectable and comfortable, but hardly magnificent or particularly distinguished among the broader landscape of English nobility, Godwin had systematically and deliberately maneuvered himself into the innermost circles of royal power and influence through a masterful combination of strategic political alliances, demonstrated military prowess on numerous battlefields, exceptional administrative competence in managing complex governmental responsibilities, and an almost supernatural ability to sense and adapt to the constantly shifting winds of political fortune that characterized the dangerous and unpredictable world of early 11th century English politics. This remarkable ascent through the treacherous ranks of medieval nobility required not only exceptional personal ability and unwavering determination, but also a sophisticated understanding of the complex web of relationships, obligations, and competing interests that defined the political landscape of the time. Godwin's success in navigating these dangerous waters, while building lasting alliances and avoiding the pitfalls that had destroyed so many other ambitious nobles, demonstrated his extraordinary intelligence, his practical wisdom, and his fundamental understanding of the delicate balance between bold action and prudent restraint that successful political leadership demanded. Harold's mother, the noble and distinguished Jothartha, brought precious and politically invaluable Danish royal blood into this ambitious and carefully calculated union, her distinguished and ancient lineage tracing its proud roots back through countless generations to the powerful and legendary Viking families that had long held dominion over the northern seas and the numerous kingdoms that bordered those treacherous and storm-tossed waters. Her illustrious family connections reached to the very heart of Scandinavian political power and cultural influence, creating a network of relationships that would prove both beneficial and dangerous as the complex political dramas of Harold's lifetime unfolded across the medieval stage of northern European politics. Her brother, the powerful and influential Ulf, the Earl, had secured his own prominent place in the intricate and ever-shifting web of Scandinavian political relationships through his strategic and highly beneficial marriage to Estrid Svensdatter, the cherished daughter of the legendary and feared Sweyn Forkbard and beloved sister to Canute the Great, the formidable Danish king who ruled England with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of sophisticated administrative efficiency and cultural accommodation. This intricate network of marriage connections and political alliances meant that young Harold was born not merely into a prominent English noble family, but into an extended family network that reached to the very pinnacle of Scandinavian royalty and political power, creating connections that would prove to be both an invaluable blessing and a potentially fatal curse as the complex political dramas and military conflicts of his lifetime played out across the turbulent landscape of medieval Europe. The magnificent and imposing manor of Bochum, perched like a precious jewel along England's picturesque southern coast, where the gentle, rolling hills of Sussex met the restless and ever-changing waters of the English Channel, served as the principal seat and symbol of the Godwin family's growing power, influence, and political authority within the kingdom. This wasn't merely a residence in any conventional sense of the term, but rather a powerful symbol of political authority, aristocratic prestige, and cultural sophistication. Its great halls decorated with the finest tapestries that Norman and Flemish craftsmen could produce, its walls echoing constantly with the intense discussions of strategy and statecraft that would ultimately shape not only the kingdom's immediate future, but the entire trajectory and direction of English civilization for centuries to come. Within these hallowed and historically significant walls, where the most important political and military decisions affecting the entire realm were debated with passionate intensity, carefully planned with meticulous attention to detail, and systematically implemented by men whose words possessed the power to raise vast armies or topple mighty kingdoms. The future of England itself was being quietly and methodically determined. The conversations that took place in Bochum's elegantly appointed chambers involved not merely local political concerns or regional administrative matters, but fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority, the relationship between different ethnic and cultural groups within the kingdom, and the complex challenges of maintaining English independence in the face of persistent foreign threats and internal political divisions. The famous Bayeux Tapestry, that remarkable and invaluable record of the momentous events that would later unfold with such dramatic and far-reaching consequences, would immortalize Bazem in its meticulously crafted and historically significant threads, depicting it as one of only 4 English locations deemed sufficiently important to warrant inclusion in that extraordinary historical narrative that would become one of medieval Europe's most treasured artistic and documentary achievements. The manor's prominent appearance in this famous work underscores its central importance to the dramatic events of 1066, serving simultaneously as Harold's beloved childhood home, the seat of his family's political power, and the launching point for the tragic journey that would ultimately lead to his heroic death on the blood-soaked battlefield of Hastings. Growing up in this rarefied and intellectually stimulating environment of privilege, political intrigue, and constant preparation for the exercise of real political power, young Harold absorbed invaluable lessons in leadership, diplomacy, military strategy, and the delicate yet absolutely crucial art of survival in the treacherous and often deadly waters of 11th century European politics. Every conversation he overheard while playing in the manor's corridors, every strategic discussion he witnessed while observing his father's meetings with other nobles, every demonstration of political maneuvering and diplomatic negotiation that took place within Bosom's historic walls, contributed significantly to his comprehensive education in the complex realities of medieval governance and the practical challenges of exercising authority in a world where personal relationships, family, loyalty, and political necessity often came into direct and irreconcilable conflict. The child who played innocently in these halls that would later become legendary in English history, who learned to ride and fight with sword and spear in the manor's extensive courtyards under the watchful eyes of experienced warriors, who absorbed the subtle rhythms of political life and diplomatic negotiation from his earliest years through constant exposure to the discussions and decisions that shaped the kingdom's destiny, was unknowingly preparing himself for an extraordinary destiny that would see him rise to the absolute pinnacle of English power and authority, only to fall tragically in one of the most consequential and historically significant battles ever fought on European soil. The world into which Harold was born was one of extraordinary complexity, constant danger, and rapidly changing political relationships, where the ancient traditions and established customs of Anglo-Saxon England existed in increasingly uneasy and potentially explosive tension with the growing entrance of Danish and Norwegian power that had fundamentally altered the entire political landscape of Northern Europe through centuries of conquest, settlement, and cultural integration. To truly understand and appreciate Harold's remarkable journey from the son of a nobleman to the King of England, we must first comprehend the intricate, often bewildering, and constantly shifting political landscape of early 11th Britain, a realm that existed in a perpetual state of tension between the old Saxon ways that had governed English society for centuries and the new realities imposed by Scandinavian conquest and the establishment of permanent Viking settlements. Throughout much of the English countryside, the Viking raids that had terrorized much of Western Europe for the better part of 3 centuries, spreading fear and destruction from Ireland to the Mediterranean, had long since evolved far beyond simple piracy and seasonal raiding expeditions into something infinitely more sophisticated, politically significant, and culturally transformative: systematic conquest and territorial occupation, permanent settlement and administrative control, and cultural integration on a massive scale that fundamentally transformed the societies they touched and created entirely new forms of political organization and social structure that blended Norse and local traditions in unprecedented ways. What had begun centuries earlier as sporadic attacks by desperate or opportunistic bands of Norse warriors seeking quick wealth through raiding and plunder, had gradually developed into carefully coordinated campaigns of conquest and settlement that established permanent Scandinavian kingdoms and political entities, stretching from the frozen shores of Greenland and Iceland in the far west to the sun-baked islands of Sicily and the rich trading cities of the Mediterranean in the distant south. These Viking kingdoms represented not merely military conquests, but genuine attempts to create lasting political institutions that could govern diverse populations while maintaining the essential characteristics of Norse culture and legal tradition. Canute the Great's extraordinary and unprecedented reign over England represented the absolute height of Scandinavian political and military power in Western Europe, creating what historians would later term a North Sea empire that stretched from the ice-bound fjords of Norway in the north to the gentle rolling hills and fertile valleys of southern England in the south. This vast political network transcended traditional geographical boundaries and cultural divisions, creating unprecedented opportunities for trade, cultural exchange, technological innovation, and political cooperation, while simultaneously imposing new forms of administrative control and military organization that would permanently alter the development and character of medieval European civilization. Under Canute's remarkably effective and enlightened rule, which combined Danish efficiency with respect for local traditions and customs, England experienced a sustained period of relative peace and unprecedented material prosperity that stood in sharp and welcome contrast to the chaos, violence, and economic disruption that had characterized the preceding decades of Viking raids, political instability, and dynastic warfare. The Danish king's administrative genius lay in his sophistication, ability to blend Scandinavian governmental efficiency and military organization with existing Anglo-Saxon institutional structures and legal traditions, creating a hybrid system that satisfied both the conquered population and the conquering elite, while generating the substantial financial resources necessary to maintain his extensive empire and defend it against numerous external threats. However, this remarkable stability and growing prosperity came at a significant and ultimately transformative cost: the effective end of independent Anglo-Saxon political development and the systematic subordination of traditional English interests to the broader strategic requirements and political objectives of Canute's extensive North Sea empire. While English culture and customs were generally respected and preserved under Danish rule, the fundamental direction of political development was now determined by Scandinavian priorities rather than purely English considerations, creating tensions and contradictions that would continue to influence English politics for generations. Earl Godwin's complex, often controversial, and ultimately successful relationship with Canute perfectly exemplified the pragmatic, survival-oriented political calculations that characterized this transformative era in English history and determined the fate of ambitious nobles throughout the period. Initially a committed supporter of Edmund Ironside, during the bitter and devastating succession struggles of 1016, when the future of English independence hung in the balance and the outcome of the conflict would determine whether England remained under Anglo-Saxon rule or became part of a Scandinavian empire. Godwin demonstrated his characteristic political wisdom and practical intelligence by quickly recognizing the futility of continued resistance. When Canute's ultimate victory became increasingly inevitable through superior resources and military effectiveness, his swift change of allegiance from the losing Anglo-Saxon cause to the victorious Danish faction, far from being viewed as dishonorable treachery or opportunistic betrayal by his contemporaries, who understood the practical realities of medieval politics, was instead seen as prudent political realism and compelling evidence of the kind of flexible thinking and practical adaptation that was absolutely necessary for survival and advancement. In an age of rapid political change and constantly shifting power relationships, medieval nobility understood that loyalty to lost causes could result not only in personal destruction, but also in the devastation of one's family, followers, and territorial holdings, making pragmatic accommodation with new rulers a matter of responsible leadership rather than personal cowardice. Canute's far-sighted decision to reward such pragmatic flexibility by elevating Godwin to the immensely powerful and historically significant earldom of Wessex represented much more than simple political calculation or administrative convenience. It demonstrated the Danish king's sophisticated understanding of the absolute necessity of incorporating existing English elites into his new governmental structure, rather than attempting to rule purely through foreign administrators and military occupation, which would have created persistent resistance and ongoing instability. Wessex, as the ancient heartland of Anglo-Saxon resistance to Viking conquest, and the legendary kingdom from which Alfred the Great had launched his heroic campaigns of reconquest against earlier Danish invaders, carried enormous symbolic significance. That made Godwin's appointment both a practical, administrative decision and a powerful statement about the integration of Saxon and Danish interests under Canute's enlightened rule. The Earl of Wessex proved himself to be absolutely invaluable to the Danish king throughout the remainder of Canute's long and generally successful reign, serving effectively as a crucial bridge between the conquered Anglo-Saxon nobility and their new Scandinavian overlords, while helping to create the political stability and administrative efficiency that characterized the Danish period of English history. Godwin's deep understanding of English law, custom, and political tradition, combined with his demonstrated loyalty to the new regime and his remarkable ability to navigate the competing demands of different ethnic and cultural groups within the kingdom, made him an indispensable component of Canute's administrative machinery and a key figure in maintaining the delicate balance between Danish authority and English autonomy. His survival and continued prosperity under Danish rule demonstrated not only his exceptional political skills and diplomatic abilities, but also his fundamental pragmatism and his willingness to adapt his loyalties and priorities to changing circumstances while maintaining his core commitment to effective governance and the welfare of his subjects. This flexibility and practical wisdom would prove to be crucial qualities that he would pass on to his son Harold, who would need similar adaptability to navigate the even more complex political challenges of the mid-11th century. However, this remarkable success and growing influence also placed the Godwin family in an inherently precarious position within the complex hierarchy of Canute's England, a position that combined great power with significant vulnerability. While they were undoubtedly powerful and influential, commanding vast resources and wielding enormous political authority, their position ultimately depended on maintaining royal favor in a political system where the king's death or a sudden shift in royal policy could instantly transform loyal allies into dangerous enemies and reduce the mightiest nobles to powerless exiles or worse. They were, in essence, influential but fundamentally vulnerable, possessing great authority but remaining ultimately dependent on the continued goodwill and favorable political calculations of rulers, whose priorities might change without warning or explanation. This dependence on royal favor, while typical of medieval political relationships, was particularly acute for families like the Godwins, who had risen through political skill rather than ancient bloodline, making their position simultaneously more powerful and more precarious than that of established noble families with deep traditional roots. Young Harold grew up watching his father navigate these treacherous political waters with consummate skill and remarkable success, absorbing crucial lessons that would serve him well during his own rise to power and eventual assumption of the English throne. The political education he received in Bosham's halls taught him the paramount importance of flexibility in political alliances, the absolute necessity of maintaining broad-based support among the nobility rather than relying too heavily on any single relationship or faction, and the critical value of being able to accurately read and respond to changing political circumstances with speed and decisiveness. These lessons in pragmatic statecraft would prove invaluable throughout Harold's career, enabling him to survive and thrive in situations that destroyed less adaptable politicians, while building the extensive network of relationships and alliances that would eventually make his successful bid for the throne possible. The ability to balance competing interests, manage complex relationships, and adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles and objectives would become hallmarks of Harold's political style and key factors in his rise to supreme power. Yet this same pragmatic approach to politics and governance would also instill in Harold a fundamentally transactional view of political relationships that would sometimes conflict with the more rigid expectations of medieval monarchy and the demands of personal honor that characterized aristocratic culture and shaped public expectations of royal behavior. The tension between practical political necessity and idealized notions of royal conduct would become a recurring theme throughout Harold's brief but eventful reign, ultimately contributing to some of the political difficulties that would weaken his position during the crisis of 1066. The influence and power of the Godwin family extended far beyond Harold himself, encompassing a remarkable network of brothers who collectively controlled an unprecedented portion of England's territory. Wealth, military resources, and political influence. Each of Harold's brothers ruled vast earldoms that, when combined and considered as a unified whole, represented nearly half of the kingdom's total geographical area and an even larger proportion of its productive agricultural capacity, commercial activity, and strategic military resources. This extraordinary concentration of power in the hands of a single family was virtually unprecedented in the entire history of Anglo-Saxon England and represented both the source of their enormous strength and political influence and the fundamental seed of their ultimate downfall and destruction. No royal dynasty could comfortably tolerate such a concentration of power in the hands of subjects, regardless of their loyalty or demonstrated competence, creating inherent tensions that would eventually contribute to the political crises that would define Harold's reign. Sweyn, the eldest of Harold's brothers and initially the most likely candidate to succeed their father as head of the family and primary heir to the Godwin political legacy, received his earldom in 1043 as part of King Edward's broader efforts to balance competing noble factions and maintain political stability throughout the kingdom. However, Sweyn's tenure as an earl was marked from the very beginning by scandal, controversy, and a disturbing pattern of reckless behavior that would ultimately disqualify him from serious consideration for higher office and remove him from any realistic possibility of succeeding to family leadership. His shocking and completely inexcusable abduction of the Abbess of Leominster represented not merely a serious personal failing or momentary lapse in judgment, but a catastrophic political miscalculation that demonstrated his fundamental inability to understand the complex relationships between secular and religious authority that governed medieval society. This outrageous act outraged both the church hierarchy and the broader nobility, leading to his immediate exile and permanent disgrace, while creating a scandal that threatened to damage the entire family's reputation for reliability and political judgment. This act of reckless passion and stunning disregard for social convention Religious authority and political consequences effectively removed Sweyn from any realistic consideration for succession to family leadership and automatically elevated Harold's position within the complex hierarchy of Godwin family politics. When Sweyn attempted to return from his continental exile and reclaim his position through appeals to family loyalty and royal mercy, his continued defiance of both secular and religious authority led to a violent confrontation with his own cousin, Beowulf, resulting in Sweyn's death and the further staining of the family's reputation among those who valued honor and reliability above personal advancement. Tostig, younger than Harold but equally ambitious and perhaps even more ruthless and single-minded in his pursuit of power and personal advancement, received appointment to the great northern earldom of Northumbria, one of the most challenging and politically significant positions in the entire kingdom. This appointment placed him in direct control of England's most turbulent and strategically crucial region, where the complex mixture of Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norwegian cultural influences created a volatile political environment that required exceptional diplomatic skill, cultural sensitivity, and administrative expertise to manage effectively and peacefully. Northumbria's critical position as England's northernmost territory made it the kingdom's primary defensive bulwark against Scottish invasion and Norwegian expansion, while its large population of Scandinavian descent created ongoing potential for political instability and foreign intervention that could threaten the security of the entire realm. The earldom's effective management required maintaining a delicate and constantly shifting balance between firm central authority and respectful accommodation of local customs and traditions, a balance that Tostig would ultimately prove completely incapable of maintaining despite his considerable personal abilities and extensive political connections. From the very beginning of his tenure as Earl, Tostig's administration was characterized by harshness, insensitivity to local concerns and cultural traditions, and a systematic disregard for the established customs and legal procedures that had governed Northumbrian society for generations. His determined attempts to impose Southern English administrative practices and legal procedures on a region with its own ancient and deeply rooted governmental traditions generated widespread resentment among the Northumbrian nobility and created the foundation for the rebellion that would eventually destroy him and contribute directly to Harold's downfall. Gurth received the strategically important earldom of East Anglia, a territory that included some of England's richest agricultural lands and most prosperous trading centres, while Leofwine was granted control over Kent and Essex, territories that included some of England's most important ports and commercial centres. These appointments meant that the Godwin family effectively controlled the eastern and southern approaches to England, giving them unprecedented influence over maritime trade, coastal defence, and royal policy regarding continental affairs and foreign relations. Only the great earldoms of Mercia and Northumbria remained outside their direct control, and even in those regions, the family's influence was substantial and growing through marriage alliances, political partnerships, and economic relationships that extended their reach far beyond their formal territorial boundaries. This near monopoly on political power created both opportunities and dangers for the family, as it provided them with enormous resources while making them potential targets for rivals who feared their growing dominance. The youngest brother, Wulf, remained at the royal court, serving simultaneously as hostage and courtier in an arrangement that was common in medieval politics, but particularly important given the Godwin family's enormous power and potential threat to royal authority. This arrangement provided the monarchy with a living guarantee of the family's continued loyalty while allowing Wulfnoth to serve as a conduit for communication between the king and his most powerful subjects, creating a system of mutual monitoring and control that helped maintain political stability. The delicate balance of trust and suspicion that characterized this relationship exemplified the complex political realities of 11th century England, where personal relationships, family loyalty, and political necessity created intricate webs of obligation and mutual dependence that could shift rapidly in response to changing circumstances. Wulfnath's position as both family member and royal hostage demonstrated that sophisticated political arrangements that maintained stability in a system where formal legal constraints on noble power were limited and personal relationships were crucial to governmental effectiveness. Harold's sister Edith represented the family's ultimate triumph. During this extraordinary period of political ascendancy and growing influence, her marriage to King Edward the Confessor in 1045 elevated the Godwins from the ranks of merely powerful nobles to become actual members of the extended royal family, with all the privileges, responsibilities, potential benefits, and inherent dangers that such an elevated position entailed within the complex hierarchy of medieval court society. No longer were they simply influential outsiders, seeking to advance their interests through political maneuvering and strategic alliances. They had become the royal family's in-laws, with direct access to the king's private councils and unprecedented influence over royal policy and decision-making processes. This transformation provided them with opportunities for advancement that had previously been unimaginable, while simultaneously creating new vulnerabilities and exposing them to the dangerous world of court intrigue and royal politics. The marriage also represented a significant political victory for King Edward, who gained valuable allies in his efforts to maintain stability and control over potentially rebellious nobles, while securing the loyalty of England's most powerful family through bonds of kinship and mutual interest. However, the union also created potential complications for royal authority by making the Godwins too powerful and influential for the comfort of other noble families or the long-term stability of the monarchy itself. Around the time of his sister's politically transformative royal marriage, Harold himself received his first major governmental appointment as Earl of East Anglia, a position that would provide him with both the material resources and the practical administrative experience necessary for his future role as the kingdom's supreme leader and eventual assumption of royal authority. This earldom encompassed some of England's richest agricultural territories and most economically important trading centres, providing Harold with access to substantial revenues, while giving him invaluable experience in the complex challenges of regional administration, military organization, judicial oversight, and diplomatic negotiation. The appointment to East Anglia also demonstrated King Edward's growing confidence in the young nobleman's administrative abilities and his shrewd recognition of the political necessity of keeping the increasingly powerful Godwin family satisfied with their share of royal patronage and governmental responsibility. By entrusting Harold with one of the kingdom's most economically vital regions, Edward was both rewarding past loyalty and creating incentives for continued cooperation between the crown and the most influential noble family in the realm. The earldom provided Harold with his first opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities as both a military commander and a civilian administrator, skills that would prove essential during his later service as the kingdom's de facto chief minister, an eventual assumption of royal authority. East Anglia faced constant threats from across the North Sea, where Norwegian and Danish kings maintained persistent claims to English territory and periodically launched raiding expeditions designed to test English defences and probe for signs of weakness or political instability that might provide opportunities for larger invasions. It was during this formative and crucial period that Harold began his long and ultimately defining relationship with Edith the Fair, a union that would endure for nearly 2 decades and produce 6 children who would carry forward the Godwin bloodline despite the political disasters that would later befall their father and destroy the family's political legacy. Edith brought significant territorial holdings in Cambridgeshire, Suffolk, and Essex to this relationship, lands that perfectly complemented Harold's new earldom and created a consolidated power base that stretched across much of eastern England and provided substantial economic resources for future political and military activities. More importantly, from a political perspective, Edith represented a crucial strategic alliance with the traditional Anglo-Saxon nobility of the eastern counties, cementing Harold's position among the established English elite, while providing him with the kind of deep-rooted local support that would prove essential during the political crises that lay ahead. Her family's connections and influence helped Harold build the extensive network of personal relationships and political alliances that would eventually enable his successful bid for the throne, while providing him with reliable supporters who understood both his capabilities and his commitment to English interests. Their marriage followed the Danish custom known as mor Danico, a form of matrimonial union that, while not formally blessed or recognized by the church hierarchy, was widely accepted and respected among the English nobility and represented one of the many ways in which Scandinavian customs had become integrated into Anglo-Saxon society over the centuries of cultural contact and political interaction. This arrangement reflected the complex cultural fusion that characterized 11th century England, where Saxon, Danish, and increasingly Norman influences had created a society that was comfortable with various forms of social, religious, and political practice while maintaining its essential English character. The legal and social acceptance of such unions meant that any children born of these relationships were considered entirely legitimate under both secular and customary law, ensuring that Harold's offspring would possess rightful claims to inheritance and social position regardless of any future changes in his marital arrangements or political circumstances. This legitimacy would prove crucial in maintaining family continuity and political influence, even in the face of the catastrophic defeats that would later destroy Harold's immediate political legacy and transform the nature of English society. The relationship with Edith the Fair reveals much about Harold's fundamental character and his sophisticated approach to political alliance building. During this crucial period of his career development, unlike the purely transactional political marriages that were common among the medieval nobility, where personal feelings were subordinated to dynastic considerations and political advantage, this union appears to have been based on genuine personal affection and mutual respect, providing Harold with not only valuable territorial holdings and political connections, but also the emotional stability and domestic happiness that would sustain him through the increasingly turbulent years of his rise to supreme power. Harold's management of his East Anglian earldom during the late 1040s and early 1050s provided compelling evidence of his exceptional capabilities as both a military commander and a civilian administrator, skills that would prove essential during his later service as the kingdom's de facto chief minister and eventual assumption of royal authority. The earldom faced constant and significant threats from across the North Sea, where Norwegian and Danish kings maintained persistent claims to English territory and periodically launched raiding expeditions designed to test English defences and probe for signs of weakness or political instability. Harold's remarkable success in defending these vulnerable coastal territories against repeated Scandinavian attacks earned him a well-deserved reputation as one of England's most competent and innovative military commanders, helping to establish his credentials as a potential future leader of the entire kingdom's defense establishment. His military innovations, including improved coastal fortifications, more efficient early warning systems, better coordination between land and naval forces, and enhanced training programs for local militia units, became influential models that were later adopted throughout the realm and contributed significantly to England's overall defensive capabilities during this period of persistent external threats. The year 1051 brought the first major political crisis of Harold's adult life, a devastating earthquake that threatened to destroy everything the Godwin family had so carefully constructed over the previous decades of patient political advancement and strategic relationship building. This crisis began seemingly innocuously when King Edward made the controversial decision to appoint Robert of Jumiages, a Norman cleric with strong continental connections and little understanding of English customs or political traditions, as Archbishop of Canterbury, bypassing several qualified English candidates and sending an unmistakable signal about his growing preference for foreign advisors over domestic counselors. The appointment of Robert represented far more than a simple ecclesiastical preference or routine administrative reorganization. It symbolized Edward's increasingly obvious alignment with Norman political interests and his apparent desire to distance himself from the powerful English families that had dominated the early years of his reign and helped establish his authority following his return from continental exile. For the Godwin family, whose influence depended heavily on their special relationship with the king and their role as intermediaries between the crown and the English nobility, this development posed an existential threat to their carefully constructed position within the kingdom's power structure. The immediate trigger for the devastating confrontation that followed came when King Edward issued a direct royal command ordering Earl Godwin to take severe punitive action against the citizens of Dover following a violent incident involving Eustace of Boulogne, the king's Norman brother-in-law, and his continental retinue during what should have been a routine diplomatic visit. The Dover incident itself was relatively minor in scope, essentially a dispute over lodgings that had escalated into streets violence resulting in several deaths on both sides. But Edward's demand that Godwin harshly punish his own people for defending themselves against foreign aggression placed the Earl in an impossible political position that would test his loyalty to both the crown and his subjects. Godwin's refusal to comply with this royal command was interpreted by Edward and his Norman advisors as an unacceptable act of defiance that could not be tolerated without fatally undermining royal authority throughout the kingdom and encouraging other nobles to resist royal commands when they conflicted with local interests. The confrontation quickly escalated beyond the original issue as both sides began gathering their supporters and preparing for what threatened to become a devastating civil war that would tear England apart at precisely the moment when foreign enemies were watching carefully for signs of internal weakness that might provide opportunities for invasion or conquest. The powerful Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, motivated by a complex combination of personal rivalry with the Godwin family, genuine concern about the implications of resisting royal authority, and their own political calculations about the likely outcome of the confrontation, sided decisively with King Edward effectively isolating the Godwins and making their political position completely untenable. Faced with the overwhelming opposition of the king and most of the other major noble families, Earl Godwin made the agonizing but ultimately wise decision to submit to exile rather than plunge England into the kind of destructive internal conflict that had repeatedly invited foreign invasion and conquest in previous centuries. The exile of 1051 forced the entire Godwin family to flee England immediately, with Harold and his brothers accompanying their father into an uncertain and potentially permanent exile on the European continent, while their vast territorial holdings were redistributed among rival families and their political influence was systematically dismantled. Queen Edith, Harold's sister, and the symbolic representation of the family's political triumph, was summarily sent to a convent. her marriage to Edward effectively annulled by his actions and her position as queen, terminated without ceremony or legal process, demonstrating the complete reversal of the family's fortunes. This devastating reversal of fortune taught Harold invaluable lessons about the fundamentally precarious nature of political power in medieval society and the absolute importance of maintaining broad-based support among the nobility rather than relying too heavily on royal favor or family connections that could be withdrawn or destroyed by changing circumstances. The experience also demonstrated the remarkable resilience and determination that would characterize Harold's later career, as the family refused to accept their disgrace as permanent and immediately began planning and organizing their eventual return to power through careful alliance building and strategic preparation. The Godwin family's exile lasted exactly 1 year, but that single year fundamentally transformed both the family itself and the kingdom they would eventually return to govern and influence. During their time on the continent, they systematically gathered supporters, built new political alliances with continental nobles and merchants, recruited mercenary forces, and prepared for an ambitious campaign that would either restore their position and influence or destroy them entirely in the attempt. Harold played an increasingly crucial role in these preparations, demonstrating the leadership abilities and strategic thinking that would eventually elevate him to the throne of England and mark him as one of the most capable political leaders of his generation. The family's triumphant return in 1052 represented a masterpiece of political and military coordination that showcased Harold's growing expertise in both diplomatic negotiation and strategic planning, while demonstrating his ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances and difficult terrain, rather than attempting a direct military assault on Edward's government, which would have branded them as rebels and traitors, while providing their enemies with moral justification for resistance. They launched a carefully orchestrated campaign, designed to demonstrate widespread popular support for their cause, while simultaneously avoiding any action that could be interpreted as outright rebellion against legitimate royal authority. Harold personally led a fleet along England's southern coast, systematically gathering ships and recruiting supporters at each port, while his father approached from Flanders with additional military forces, recruited from continental allies and mercenary companies. This coordinated two-pronged approach maximized their military effectiveness, while minimizing the political risks associated with their return, creating a situation where they appeared to be responding to popular demand rather than pursuing personal ambition or seeking revenge against their former enemies. The strategy proved brilliantly successful in ways that exceeded even the family's most optimistic expectations and demonstrated the depth of their continued support among both the nobility and the common people of England. As news of the Godwin return spread rapidly across England through networks of supporters and sympathizers, followers flocked to their banners in numbers that clearly demonstrated the family's continued popularity among all levels of English society and their reputation as champions of English interests against increasing foreign influence and Norman domination of the royal court. When the royal fleet was ordered to intercept the returning exiles and prevent their landing through force of arms, many English sailors openly refused to fight against their former lords, recognizing that the confrontation represented more than a simple matter of royal authority versus noble rebellion, but rather a fundamental choice between English interests and foreign influence. The potential naval battle that might have resulted in devastating bloodshed and irreparable political division instead became an opportunity for negotiation and compromise, as Edward found himself increasingly isolated and abandoned by many of his own supposed supporters who had grown weary of Norman domination and foreign advisors. The Restoration Agreement, reached in late 1052, represented a complete and comprehensive victory for the Godwin family that exceeded their most ambitious pre-exile position and demonstrated their indispensable role in maintaining political stability within the kingdom. Not only were they restored to their former earldoms and governmental positions with full honours and recognition, but many of Edward's Norman advisors were expelled from the kingdom entirely, never to return to positions of influence in English politics or royal administration. Robert of Jomages fled to Normandy in permanent disgrace, while other continental influences were similarly purged from the royal court and governmental apparatus, marking a decisive triumph for English political independence. Harold and his brothers resumed their earldoms with enhanced prestige and significantly increased political authority, having demonstrated their indispensability to the kingdom's stability and their remarkable ability to survive and overcome even the most serious political challenges while maintaining popular support and noble loyalty. The successful return from exile established Harold as one of the kingdom's premier political leaders and demonstrated his exceptional capabilities in crisis management, strategic planning, and political negotiation under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. At 30 years of age, Harold had proven himself capable of surviving and thriving in the most challenging and dangerous political circumstances that medieval politics could present, skills that would prove essential during the even greater crises that lay ahead in his future career. His central role in organizing the return campaign and negotiating the restoration settlement demonstrated his leadership potential to both supporters and potential rivals throughout the kingdom, marking him clearly as the most likely candidate to succeed his aging father as head of the family and unofficial leader of the English nobility. The death of Earl Godwin in 1053 marked a fundamental turning point in Harold's life and career, as well as in the broader development of English political history and the evolution of the kingdom's governmental structure. The patriarch's passing left a significant power vacuum that only Harold possessed the experience, demonstrated ability, extensive political connections, and established family relationships necessary to fill effectively and maintain the family's dominant position within the kingdom's political hierarchy. His succession to the immensely powerful and symbolically important earldom of Wessex elevated him to become the most powerful lay figure in England after the king himself, a position that would serve as the natural stepping stone to eventual assumption of royal authority and provide him with the resources and political foundation necessary for his future bid for the throne. The transition from son to family patriarch also marked Harold's emergence as a major political figure in his own right, rather than simply a member of his father's political organization. Wessex was far more than an ordinary earldom or simple administrative district within the kingdom's governmental structure. It represented the ancient heartland of Anglo-Saxon England and carried immense historical and symbolic significance that extended far beyond its considerable material resources and strategic importance for the kingdom's defense. As the legendary kingdom from which Alfred the Great had launched his heroic campaigns against Viking conquest and the traditional seat of Anglo-Saxon royal power and cultural authority, Wessex embodied the continuity and legitimacy of English resistance to foreign domination and the preservation of traditional English values and institutions. Control of this historically significant earldom meant effective control of southern England and, by extension, primary responsibility for the kingdom's defense against continental invasion, while providing Harold with enormous economic resources and military capabilities. The symbolic importance of Wessex also enhanced Harold's political legitimacy and provided him with powerful arguments for his eventual claim to the throne, as he could present himself as the heir to Alfred's legacy and the defender of traditional English independence against foreign threats. Harold's administration of his inherited Wessex territories revealed his exceptional talents as both a military commander and an innovative civilian administrator, skills that clearly distinguished him from many of his contemporaries who excelled in one area but struggled with the complex demands of comprehensive regional governance and the multiple challenges of medieval administration. Unlike previous earls, who had often treated their territories primarily as sources of revenue and military recruitment for their personal advancement, Harold took a genuine and active interest in improving the daily lives of his subjects and strengthening the fundamental institutions of local government and legal administration. His comprehensive reforms in legal procedure, tax collection methods, military organization, and administrative efficiency became influential models that were subsequently adopted throughout the kingdom, demonstrating his capacity for innovative thinking and systematic problem-solving, while establishing his reputation as an effective and forward-thinking administrator. These administrative innovations not only improved the efficiency and effectiveness of government in his own territories, but also enhanced his reputation among the broader nobility as a leader, capable of translating theoretical knowledge into practical improvements that benefited both rulers and subjects. The new Earl of Wessex also demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill in managing the complex relationships between different ethnic and cultural groups within his extensive territories, where diverse populations had to be governed effectively while maintaining their distinct identities and traditions. Anglo-Saxons, Danes, and even small communities of Norman settlers lived side by side throughout Wessex, each group maintaining its own distinct customs, legal traditions, religious practices, and cultural practices, while acknowledging Harold's overarching political authority and participating in the broader economic and social life of the earldom. His success in navigating these cultural differences and maintaining peaceful coexistence among potentially hostile communities marked him as a leader of exceptional diplomatic skill and cultural sensitivity, qualities that would prove essential during his eventual reign as king, when he would need to govern an even more diverse and potentially fractious population. Harold's ability to balance competing cultural demands while maintaining effective central authority demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the challenges of governing a multicultural society and his practical wisdom in managing potentially explosive ethnic and religious tensions. Harold's growing military reputation during his tenure as Earl of Wessex established him as one of Europe's most capable and innovative commanders, a reputation that would prove crucial during the multiple military crises of 1066 and the challenges of defending England against simultaneous invasions from multiple directions. He successfully defended the kingdom's vulnerable southern coastline against numerous Viking raids and attempted invasions, developed new defensive strategies that maximized the effectiveness of English forces against superior numbers of attackers, and built an extensive network of loyal thanes and professional housecarls who would later form the reliable core of his royal army during his brief but eventful reign. These military successes enhanced Harold's reputation not only throughout England but across northern Europe, where his tactical innovations and strategic thinking were studied and admired by military leaders who recognized his exceptional capabilities and sought to learn from his successful defensive campaigns. His ability to adapt traditional Anglo-Saxon military methods to meet new challenges while incorporating useful innovations from continental military practice marked him as a commander of genuine originality and flexibility, capable of responding effectively to changing tactical situations and evolving military technologies. Perhaps most importantly for his future political career and eventual assumption of royal authority, Harold's years as Earl of Wessex allowed him to develop and strengthen the extensive network of personal relationships and political alliances that would prove absolutely crucial to his eventual successful bid for the throne and his ability to maintain power during the challenging period that followed. He carefully cultivated friendships and working relationships with leading churchmen throughout the kingdom, including the influential and politically important Archbishop Stig, maintained cordial and productive relations with the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, despite occasional political disagreements and competing interests, and built a broad-based power network that extended far beyond his own earldom's geographical boundaries. Harold's reputation as a military commander reached its absolute peak during his extended campaigns against the Welsh kingdoms in the late 1050s and early 1060s, conflicts that tested English military capabilities against determined, skilled, and culturally sophisticated opponents who possessed intimate knowledge of their own terrain and long experience in resisting foreign conquest attempts. These campaigns demonstrated Harold's tactical brilliance and strategic vision, while establishing him as one of medieval Europe's premier military leaders, and proving his ability to conduct complex military operations over extended periods, while maintaining political support for his objectives. The Welsh threat to English security was both ancient and immediate, rooted in centuries of border warfare and cultural conflict between Celtic and Anglo-Saxon civilizations that had created a legacy of mutual suspicion and periodic violence. The kingdoms of Wales had traditionally served as refuges for displaced Anglo-Saxon nobles fleeing political persecution and as launching points for damaging raids against English border territories, creating persistent security challenges that required constant vigilance and periodic military intervention to contain and control. Under the exceptional leadership of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, a ruler of genuine ability and political vision, the Welsh had achieved an unprecedented level of political unity and military effectiveness that posed a genuinely serious challenge to English territorial integrity and border security for the first time in generations. Gruffyd's success in uniting the traditionally fractious and competitive Welsh kingdoms under his personal authority while forming strategic alliances with various enemies of the English crown created a formidable opponent that could not be ignored or dealt with through traditional diplomatic means. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn was far from an ordinary opponent or typical medieval warlord, seeking personal advancement through military conquest. A skilled military leader, cunning politician, and charismatic ruler who commanded genuine loyalty from his followers, he had succeeded in creating a unified Welsh resistance that combined traditional Celtic advantages with sophisticated military techniques and political strategies. His forces successfully combined traditional Welsh advantages in mobility and intimate knowledge of local terrain with sophisticated military techniques learned through extensive contact with continental armies and mercenary forces, creating a military capability that posed serious challenges to English strategic planning. Harold's initial campaigns against the Welsh in 1055 met with mixed and often frustrating results that demonstrated the inadequacy of traditional English military approaches when applied to this particular type of warfare and terrain. The conventional English strategy of mounting large-scale, punitive expeditions into Welsh territory had proven consistently ineffective against Gruffyd's highly mobile forces, who could strike quickly and effectively against English targets before disappearing into the mountainous terrain of their homeland, where pursuit was difficult and dangerous while offering little prospect of decisive military resolution. Harold quickly recognized that conventional tactics and traditional strategic approaches would not suffice against such an adaptive and tactically sophisticated opponent who possessed natural advantages that neutralized many English military strengths. His willingness to acknowledge the limitations of existing military doctrine and develop entirely new approaches to this strategic challenge demonstrated the flexibility and innovative thinking that characterized his approach to complex problems throughout his career, marking him as a military leader capable of learning from experience and adapting to changing circumstances. The turning point in Harold's Welsh campaigns came when he developed and implemented a revolutionary strategic approach that combined traditional English military strengths with tactical innovations borrowed from his continental experiences and careful study of successful campaigns against similar opponents in other regions. Rather than continuing to pursue Welsh forces into their mountain strongholds, where English advantages in heavy cavalry and organized infantry formations were largely neutralized by terrain and climate, he focused his efforts on controlling and systematically devastating the fertile lowlands where Gruffudd's forces depended for agricultural supplies, recruitment of new soldiers, and economic resources necessary to maintain their military effectiveness over extended periods. This strategy of economic warfare, combined with systematic destruction of Welsh agricultural infrastructure and careful coordination with Pranglish Welsh factions who opposed Gruffudd's rule, gradually weakened Welsh resistance and forced the enemy to fight on terms more favorable to English military organization and tactical preferences. The campaign demonstrated Harold's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military action and economic pressure, as well as his ability to sustain complex operations over extended periods, while maintaining political support for his military objectives and keeping his forces motivated despite the challenges of prolonged campaigning in difficult terrain. The climactic campaigns of 1062 to 1063 showcased Harold's military genius at its absolute finest and most innovative, demonstrating his ability to coordinate complex military operations across vast distances while maintaining tactical flexibility and strategic coherence, working in close coordination with his brother Tostig, who mounted a parallel campaign from the north while Harold advanced from the south. He executed an enormously complex pincer movement that successfully trapped Gruffudd's forces and prevented their usual escape into the safety of Welsh mountain strongholds, where they could regroup and prepare for renewed resistance. The level of coordination required for such a sophisticated operation across difficult terrain and vast distances demonstrated Harold's exceptional organizational abilities and his capacity for strategic thinking on a grand scale, as well as his ability to maintain effective communication and cooperation with other commanders while adapting to changing tactical situations. The successful execution of this complex strategic plan marked Harold as one of the most capable military leaders of his generation and established his reputation as a commander capable of achieving decisive victories against formidable opponents. Through superior planning and execution, the final campaign culminated in Gruffudd's death in 1063, killed not in direct battle with English forces but at the hands of his own followers, who had grown weary of the devastating conflict and chose submission over continued resistance that promised only further destruction and suffering for their people. Harold's victory was complete and comprehensive. The Welsh kingdoms were brought under English overlordship for the first time in centuries, their military threat permanently neutralized, and their territories opened to English settlement and administrative control, creating a secure western frontier that would no longer require constant military attention and resources. The successful conclusion of the Welsh campaigns established Harold's reputation throughout medieval Europe as a military commander of the absolute first rank, whose tactical innovations, strategic vision, and ability to adapt English military methods to meet novel challenges marked him as a leader capable of defending England against any conceivable foreign threat. This hard-earned reputation would prove crucial during the events of 1066, when multiple powerful enemies would simultaneously challenge his right to rule and threaten the very existence of independent English monarchy through coordinated invasions from multiple directions. One of the most controversial and historically significant episodes in Harold's entire life occurred around 1064, when he undertook a mysterious and ultimately fateful journey to Normandy that would later provide Duke William with crucial propaganda ammunition for justifying his invasion of England and recruiting support from across continental Europe. The exact circumstances surrounding this journey remain shrouded in mystery and scholarly debate, with Norman and English sources providing fundamentally conflicting accounts of Harold's motivations, actions, and commitments during his time on the continent, creating one of medieval history's most enduring controversies. According to the detailed Norman chroniclers, particularly those writing after the successful conquest of England, when accuracy was less important than political utility, Harold was deliberately sent to Normandy by King Edward with the specific mission of confirming Duke William as the king's chosen heir to the English throne and formalizing arrangements that had allegedly been made years earlier. This official Norman narrative presents Harold as Edward's trusted emissary, dispatched to formalize and solidify an arrangement allegedly made years earlier when William had supposedly been promised the English succession in recognition of his family relationship to Edward and his support during the king's long exile years in Normandy. English sources, however, suggest entirely different and far more innocuous explanations for Harold's presence in Norman territory that do not involve any formal diplomatic mission or royal commitment to William's succession. Some contemporary accounts indicate that he was attempting to secure the release of family members who had been held as hostages since the political crisis and exile of 1051, when Earl Godwin had been forced to provide guarantees of his future loyalty to the crown through the surrender of close relatives. Other sources suggest that Harold was simply undertaking a private journey, possibly for commercial purposes or personal reasons, that went catastrophically wrong when unexpected storms drove his ship far off course and into dangerous waters. What appears certain from all surviving accounts is that Harold's ship was wrecked off the coast of Ponthieu, where he was captured by Count Guy and held for ransom in accordance with established medieval customs regarding shipwrecked nobles and the rights of coastal lords to claim salvage from vessels foundering in their territorial waters. This misfortune placed Harold in an extremely vulnerable and politically dangerous position, as he was now a prisoner in foreign territory, with limited means of securing his release and no guarantee that his captors would respect his rank or treat him with the courtesy due to his elevated status within the English nobility and his position as one of Europe's most powerful earls. The intervention of Duke William, who demanded Harold's immediate transfer to his custody through a combination of diplomatic pressure and veiled threats, may have saved the English earl's life, but simultaneously placed him in an even more complex and potentially compromising political situation that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Anglo-Norman relations. William's motives for securing Harold's release from Count Guy remain a subject of historical speculation, but they likely involved a sophisticated calculation about the potential value of establishing a personal relationship with one of England's most powerful and influential nobles during a period when the English succession remained uncertain and multiple claimants were positioning themselves for future opportunities. The detailed account of Harold's extended stay in Normandy, as depicted in the famous Bayeux tapestry and described in various Norman chroniclers writing both contemporary accounts and later retrospective histories, presents a carefully constructed narrative of friendship, mutual respect, and shared military adventure between the two future adversaries that would later face each other at Hastings. Harold is shown participating actively in William's campaign against Conan of Brittany, receiving ceremonial arms and honors from the Duke, and being treated as an honored guest rather than a prisoner or political hostage, creating an impression of voluntary cooperation and mutual esteem. This generous treatment suggests that William recognized the potential value of maintaining positive relations with the powerful English Earl and possibly saw an opportunity to create obligations and relationships that might prove useful in future political negotiations or military campaigns. The ceremonial aspects of Harold's treatment, including his apparent participation in military operations and his receipt of arms and honors, created precedents and relationships that Norman propaganda would later exploit to support claims about Harold's commitments and obligations to William. The most controversial and historically significant aspect of Harold's Norman sojourn was the sacred oath he allegedly swore to support William's claim to the English throne, an event that would later become central to Norman propaganda efforts to justify the invasion of 1066 and recruit international support for William's cause. The Bayeux tapestry depicts this ceremony in extraordinary detail, showing Harold placing his hands solemnly on sacred relics while William observes the proceedings, creating a visual record that Norman apologists would later cite as irrefutable evidence of Harold's subsequent treachery and oath-breaking when he claimed the throne for himself. Norman sources treat this oath as a sacred and legally binding commitment that Harold later violated when he claimed the throne for himself following Edward's death, making him not merely a political rival but a perjurer and oath-breaker, deserving of divine punishment and earthly retribution. The ceremonial nature of the oath-taking, conducted in the presence of sacred relics and witnessed by numerous nobles from both Normandy and England, gave it particular gravity under medieval concepts of honor and religious obligation, making any subsequent violation a matter of both personal dishonor and spiritual damnation that justified extreme measures to remedy. English sources are notably and conspicuously silent about any such oath, leading many modern historians to question whether it actually occurred as described, or whether it represents a later Norman fabrication designed to provide legal and moral justification for what would otherwise appear to be an unprovoked invasion of a neighboring kingdom by an ambitious duke seeking territorial expansion. If the oath did indeed take place, as Norman sources claim, Harold may have been effectively coerced into swearing it as the unavoidable price of his freedom, making its moral and legal validity questionable under established medieval principles governing oaths extracted under duress or given by prisoners seeking release. The journey to Normandy, regardless of its original purpose or the true nature of Harold's commitments there, had profound and lasting consequences for both Harold personally and for the future of England itself, creating complications and providing ammunition for future conflicts that would ultimately contribute to the catastrophic events of 1066. It provided William with an invaluable propaganda tool that would prove crucial in recruiting international support for his invasion, while simultaneously placing Harold in the politically awkward position of having to explain his actions and defend his honor before both the English nobility and the broader European community of kings and nobles. The episode perfectly demonstrates the complex web of personal relationships, political obligations, and competing loyalties that characterized 11th century European politics, where a single journey or ceremony could fundamentally alter the balance of power between kingdoms and create justifications for conflicts that would reshape the entire political landscape of medieval Europe. Harold's experience in Normandy would haunt him throughout his brief reign and provide his enemies with powerful ammunition for challenging both his legitimacy and his honor, ultimately contributing to the international isolation that would weaken His position during the crisis of 1066, the final years of Edward the Confessor's reign, were increasingly dominated by growing tensions within the Godwin family itself, tensions that would ultimately contribute directly to the political and military disasters of 1066 and the successful Norman conquest of England. The crisis centered primarily on Harold's brother, Tostig, and his progressively unpopular and oppressive rule in the strategically crucial northern earldom of Northumbria, a situation that would eventually force Harold to make an agonizing choice between family loyalty and political necessity, while demonstrating the fundamental fragility of even the most powerful noble families in medieval politics. Tostig's appointment as Earl of Northumbria in 1055 had initially been viewed as a significant triumph for the Godwin family, representing the successful extension of their influence into England's most challenging and politically sensitive northern territory, while providing them with control over the kingdom's primary defence against Scottish invasion and Norwegian expansion. Northumbria was a region of extraordinary complexity and strategic importance, where the intricate mixture of Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norwegian cultural influences created a volatile political environment that required exceptional diplomatic skill, cultural sensitivity, and administrative expertise to manage effectively and peacefully. The earldom's position as England's northernmost territory made it the kingdom's primary defensive bulwark against Scottish invasion and Norwegian expansion, while its substantial population of Scandinavian descent created ongoing potential for political instability and foreign intervention that could threaten the security of the entire realm if not carefully managed. Effective governance of Northumbria required maintaining a delicate and constantly shifting balance between firm central authority and respectful accommodation of local customs and traditions, a balance that Tostig unfortunately proved completely incapable of maintaining despite his considerable personal abilities and extensive political connections within the broader Godwin family network. From the very beginning of his tenure as Earl, Tostig's administration was characterized by harshness, insensitivity to local concerns and cultural traditions, and a systematic disregard for the established customs and legal procedures that had governed Northumbrian society for generations. His determined attempts to impose Southern English administrative practices and legal procedures on a region with its own ancient and deeply rooted governmental traditions generated widespread resentment among the Northumbrian nobility and created the foundation for the rebellion that would eventually destroy him and contribute directly to Harold's downfall. Tostig's heavy-handed taxation policies, particularly his controversial decision to double tribute payments in 1065, as part of his efforts to fund expanded military forces and administrative reforms, transformed this underlying resentment into active rebellion and open resistance to his continued rule. The Northumbrian thanes, many of whom traced their ancestry back to the original Danish settlers and maintained strong cultural connections to Scandinavia, viewed Tostig's fiscal demands as both economically oppressive and culturally insensitive, representing an unacceptable attempt to subordinate their traditional autonomy to Southern English administrative efficiency and royal fiscal demands. The Northumbrian Revolt of 1065 began as a focused protest against Tostig's oppressive fiscal policies but quickly evolved into a comprehensive rebellion aimed at his complete removal from power and the restoration of traditional Northumbrian governmental practices that respected local customs and cultural traditions. The rebels, led by prominent local thanes who commanded extensive popular support and possessed the military resources necessary to sustain prolonged resistance, seized control of York and formally declared Tostig an outlaw, effectively deposing him and challenging the authority of the crown itself to impose unpopular administrators on unwilling subjects. The rebellion enjoyed widespread support not only among the Anglo-Saxon population, but also among the region's substantial Danish community, who remembered their own historical traditions of limited monarchy and participatory governance and viewed Tostig's autocratic administrative style as a fundamental violation of their ancestral rights and freedoms. This broad-based opposition made any attempt to restore Tostig through military force extremely dangerous and potentially counterproductive, as it would require fighting against the united population of England's most strategically important northern territory while potentially inviting foreign intervention from Scotland or Norway. The crisis placed Harold in an impossible and personally agonizing position that would test both his political judgment and his family loyalty, while forcing him to choose between competing obligations and conflicting principles. As Tostig's brother and the acknowledged head of the Godwin family following their father's death, Harold was naturally expected to support his sibling and defend family interests against outside challengers, regardless of the political costs or practical difficulties involved in such support. According to the traditional codes of family loyalty that governed noble behavior, however, as King Edward's principal advisor and the man most widely expected to succeed to the throne upon the king's death, Harold also had to consider the broader implications of the Northumbrian crisis for the overall stability and security of the kingdom as a whole. A prolonged civil war in the strategically crucial northern territories would inevitably weaken England's defences precisely at the moment when foreign enemies were carefully watching for signs of internal division and military vulnerability that might provide opportunities for invasion or conquest. King Edward's decision to send Harold north to negotiate directly with the rebels represented both a recognition of Harold's exceptional diplomatic skills and a crucial test of his loyalty to the crown and his commitment to the kingdom's broader interests over narrow family considerations. The mission required Harold to balance competing and potentially irreconcilable demands: the king's natural desire to maintain royal authority and uphold the principle that earls served at royal pleasure, Tostig's desperate determination to retain his position and restore his damaged reputation, and the rebels' absolute insistence on his permanent removal from any position of authority in Northumbrian affairs. Harold's careful and methodical handling of the Northumbrian crisis demonstrated his remarkable political maturity and his willingness to place the kingdom's long-term interests above immediate family considerations, even when such decisions would inevitably result in personal pain and family discord that would have lasting consequences for his relationships with surviving family members. After conducting a thorough assessment of the situation and consulting extensively with representatives of all parties involved in the conflict, he reached the difficult but ultimately wise conclusion that Tostig's position had become completely untenable and that any attempt to restore him through military force would likely result in catastrophic civil war. His recommendation that Tostig be permanently replaced by Murcar of Mercia, a member of a rival noble family with strong connections to the Northumbrian rebels and a reputation for competent administration, represented a painful betrayal of family loyalty, but a triumph of political wisdom and strategic thinking that prioritized the kingdom's stability over personal relationships. The decision demonstrated Harold's recognition that effective governance required the consent of the governed, and that even royal authority had practical limitations when confronted with determined popular resistance backed by legitimate grievances. The resolution of the crisis required Tostig to accept the bitter reality of permanent exile, a development that instantly transformed him from Harold's closest ally and political supporter into his most dangerous and implacable personal enemy, with both the motivation and the knowledge necessary to cause maximum damage to his brother's future prospects. Tostig's expulsion from England would have far-reaching and ultimately catastrophic consequences. as his burning desire for revenge would eventually lead him into alliance with Harold's foreign enemies and provide them with crucial intelligence about English defensive preparations and political weaknesses that would prove invaluable during the invasions of 1066. The Northumbrian crisis also provided a stark demonstration of the fundamental fragility of the Godwin family's seemingly overwhelming political power and influence, showing how quickly circumstances could change and how personal relationships could be destroyed by the relentless pressures of political necessity and the competing demands of family loyalty and public responsibility. The episode revealed the heavy personal costs of political leadership and the inevitable tensions between private affection and public duty that characterized medieval governance and made effective leadership such a challenging and personally demanding undertaking. Harold's strategic marriage to Ilgeth, daughter of Earl Glafgar and sister to the newly appointed Earl Mercar, represented the final component of the political settlement that ended the Northumbrian crisis, while demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for political advantage and long-term stability. This marriage, which required Harold to set aside his long relationship with Edith the Fair and abandon the domestic arrangements that had provided him with emotional stability for nearly 2 decades, provided tangible evidence of his commitment to building bridges with former rivals and healing the political divisions created by the crisis. The union with Ilgith strengthened Harold's position with the powerful Mercian nobility while providing some measure of compensation to Morcar's family for their crucial support during the crisis and their willingness to take responsibility for governing the troubled northern territories. The marriage also created new kinship bonds that would theoretically help prevent future conflicts between the Godwin and Mercian factions, though these hopes would ultimately prove insufficient to prevent the political disasters that lay ahead and the collapse of unified English resistance to foreign invasion. The winter of 1065 to 1066 brought an atmosphere of mounting tension and foreboding to the English court as King Edward the Confessor's health steadily declined and the reality of his approaching death became increasingly apparent to everyone who observed his failing condition and recognized the implications for the kingdom's future. The childless monarch, now in his early 60s, had provided England with nearly a quarter-century of relative stability and material prosperity, creating the peaceful conditions that allowed the kingdom to develop its resources and strengthen its defenses against the constant threats that surrounded it. But his approaching death would inevitably usher in a period of uncertainty and potential conflict. Edward's inability to produce an heir had been a source of persistent concern throughout his long reign, but the problem became acute and unavoidable as he entered what were clearly his final months of life, and the succession question could no longer be postponed or ignored. The king's well-documented reputation for exceptional piety had led to widespread speculation that he had voluntarily taken a vow of celibacy that precluded the production of legitimate heirs. Though whether this was actually true, or whether the royal marriage to Edith Godwin had simply proven naturally unfruitful, remained a subject of debate among contemporary observers and would continue to puzzle historians for centuries. What was absolutely certain, however, was that England faced a succession crisis of unprecedented complexity and danger that could easily lead to devastating civil war. For an invasion, or the complete collapse of the unified English monarchy that had been carefully constructed over the previous century through the efforts of successive kings and their noble supporters. The absence of a clear and undisputed heir created a power vacuum that would inevitably attract multiple claimants, each backed by powerful supporters and each capable of making plausible arguments for their legitimacy while possessing the military resources necessary to press their claims through force of arms. Several potential claimants to the English throne had emerged and begun positioning themselves politically by the time of Edward's final illness. each representing different principles of succession and different visions for England's future development. The strongest hereditary claim belonged unquestionably to Edgar Theling, Edward's great-nephew and the last surviving male representative of the ancient royal house of Wessex, that traced its lineage back through the legendary kings who had first unified England under Anglo-Saxon rule and established the governmental and cultural foundations of English civilization. However, Edgar faced the insurmountable disadvantage of being only 14 years old and completely lacking in the political support, military experience, administrative knowledge, and established power base necessary to secure and maintain the throne against adult rivals who commanded their own armies and possessed extensive governmental experience. Medieval kingship required not just legitimate birth, but also proven capability in warfare, diplomacy, and administration, qualities that a boy could not possibly possess regardless of his bloodline or the theoretical strength of his hereditary claim to royal authority. However, Edgar faced the insurmountable disadvantage of being only 14 years old and completely lacking in the political support, military experience, administrative knowledge, and established power base necessary to secure and maintain the throne against adult rivals who commanded their own armies and possessed extensive governmental experience. Medieval kingship required not just legitimate birth, but also proven capability in warfare, diplomacy, and administration, qualities that a boy could not possibly possess regardless of his bloodline or the theoretical strength of his hereditary claim to royal authority. Harold Godwinson represented by far the most powerful domestic claimant to the succession, combining extensive territorial holdings, proven military capability, demonstrated administrative competence, and unmatched political influence within the existing governmental structure of the kingdom. As Earl of Wessex and the king's brother-in-law, he commanded vast military resources and enjoyed widespread support among the English nobility, who recognized his administrative competence, respected his record of successful military leadership against foreign enemies, and trusted his commitment to defending English independence against foreign threats. His long service as Edward's chief minister and unofficial deputy had provided him with invaluable experience in the practical challenges of royal governance, from managing the complex relationships between competing noble factions to overseeing the kingdom's financial administration and coordinating defensive preparations against foreign threats. His military victories against the Welsh had established his reputation as a capable war leader fully qualified to defend England against the multiple external threats that constantly menaced the kingdom's security and territorial integrity. Perhaps, most importantly, from a practical political perspective, Harold possessed the immediate political strength and military resources necessary to act decisively during the inevitable crisis that would follow Edward's death, when speed and determination would be crucial factors in determining the outcome of the succession struggle. His extensive network of personal relationships, political alliances, and military obligations provided him with the foundation for effective royal authority and the ability to mobilize England's defensive resources quickly and efficiently. Duke William of Normandy based his claim primarily on his family relationship to Edward through the king's mother, Emma of Normandy, who had been a member of the Norman ducal family before her marriage into the English royal line, and whose continental connections had provided Edward with crucial support during his long exile years. William also claimed that Edward had explicitly promised him the succession during the king's exile years in Normandy, when the future king had been dependent on Norman hospitality and protection for his survival and eventual restoration to the English throne. William's claim was significantly strengthened by the support of Pope Alexander II, who had formally endorsed the Norman duke's cause and provided him with a papal banner as a symbol of divine approval for his enterprise, and ecclesiastical sanction for his invasion plans. The papal endorsement gave William's invasion the character of a holy war and helped him recruit supporters from across Catholic Europe, who viewed the expedition as a religiously sanctified undertaking rather than mere territorial aggression or dynastic ambition. The Norman military machine represented one of the most formidable and technologically advanced fighting forces in medieval Europe, combining innovative cavalry tactics with sophisticated siege warfare techniques and supported by extensive financial resources that allowed William to maintain professional armies in the field for extended periods while conducting complex military operations. However, William faced the obvious disadvantage that he was a foreigner who would need to conquer England militarily to make good his pretensions to the throne, requiring him to organize and execute one of the most ambitious amphibious invasions in medieval history. Harold Hardrada of Norway represented the final major claimant, basing his pretensions on the alleged agreement between Harthacnut and Magnus of Norway that the survivor would inherit all of the other's territories, including the crown of England and the extensive resources that came with control of England's wealth and strategic position. Though this claim was legally questionable and had never been seriously pressed during Edward's lifetime, Hardrada commanded formidable military resources and the enthusiastic support of Norwegian nobles, who were eager for the wealth and glory that successful conquest of England would bring to their homeland. The Norwegian king was widely regarded as one of the most experienced and successful military commanders in medieval Europe, having spent decades campaigning from Sicily to Constantinople and building a reputation for tactical brilliance and personal courage that made him a genuinely dangerous opponent, capable of mounting a serious challenge to any rival claimant. His alliance with the exiled Tostig, Godwinson, provided him with valuable intelligence about English defensive preparations and political weaknesses while giving his invasion the appearance of supporting a legitimate English claimant rather than pursuing naked foreign conquest. As Edward lay dying in his magnificently appointed palace at Westminster, the atmosphere of impending crisis intensified dramatically with each passing day, as courtiers, nobles, and foreign observers recognized that the king's death would trigger a succession struggle that could reshape the entire political landscape of Northern Europe. The Vita Didwadi Regis, our most detailed and reliable contemporary source for the king's final days, provides a haunting description of his mysterious dream or prophetic vision in which the long-dead monks appeared to deliver a terrifying prophecy about England's future that would prove remarkably prescient in light of subsequent events. According to this extraordinary account, Edward foretold with startling accuracy that God will deliver all this kingdom into the hands of the enemy, and devils will come through all this land with fire and sword and the havoc of war. This apocalyptic vision, whether interpreted as genuine divine revelation or the fevered imaginings of a dying man struggling with consciousness and approaching death, proved remarkably prescient in light of the catastrophic events that would soon unfold across England and transform the kingdom beyond recognition. The death of Edward the Confessor on January 5, 1066, marked the definitive end of an era in English history and the beginning of one of the most turbulent and consequential years in the entire medieval period, a year that would witness multiple invasions, devastating battles, and fundamental changes that would permanently alter the character of English civilization. His 24-year reign had provided unprecedented stability and material prosperity, creating the conditions for economic growth, cultural development, and military strengthening. But his failure to produce an heir ensured that his death would usher in a period of conflict, uncertainty, and ultimately fundamental transformation that would permanently alter the trajectory of English historical development. The stage was now set for the dramatic events that would determine not only who would rule England, but what kind of nation England would become, whether it would remain an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom preserving its ancient laws and customs, or be absorbed into a continental empire that would transform its governmental institutions, cultural practices, and social structure. The succession crisis of 1066 would test every aspect of English society and ultimately result in changes so profound that they would echo through centuries of subsequent history and influence the development of medieval European civilization. Harold's assumption of the throne on January 6, 1066, represented both the culmination of his family's long rise to power and the beginning of the most challenging period of his entire life, as he faced the daunting task of defending his crown against multiple claimants who possessed both the motivation and the resources necessary to challenge his authority through military force. The Witenagemot, England's traditional council of nobles and high clergy, had faced an extraordinarily difficult decision in choosing between multiple claimants with competing strengths and weaknesses. But their selection of Harold reflected a realistic assessment of the immediate challenges facing the kingdom and the qualities necessary for effective leadership during a period of imminent crisis and foreign threat. The speed with which Harold was elected and crown-taking place on the very day following Edward's death demonstrated both the urgency of the political situation and the broad consensus among the English elite that decisive action was necessary to prevent the kingdom from fragmenting into competing factions or falling prey to foreign invasion while leadership remained uncertain. The rapidity of the succession process also reflected Harold's careful political preparation and his success in building the extensive network of relationships and alliances that made his elevation to the throne both possible and widely accepted among those who possessed the political authority to make such crucial decisions. Harold's coronation ceremony, conducted in the newly completed Westminster Abbey, just feet from Edward's freshly dug grave, carried enormous symbolic significance that emphasized continuity with the past while marking the beginning of a new dynasty and a new era in English royal history. The choice of Westminster rather than the traditional royal seat at Winchester demonstrated Harold's commitment to Edward's architectural legacy while positioning the new monarchy at the heart of England's emerging commercial and administrative centre, where royal authority could be more effectively exercised and displayed. The ceremony itself followed ancient Anglo-Saxon traditions that emphasized the sacred nature of kingship and the divine sanction for royal authority, with Archbishop Ealdred of York performing the coronation rites that would theoretically make Harold God's anointed representative on earth and invest him with the spiritual authority necessary for effective royal leadership. The religious solemnity of the occasion was designed to emphasize Harold's legitimacy and divine approval while creating moral obligations for his subjects to support his rule and resist challenges to his authority from foreign claimants. However, Harold's rapid assumption of the throne also created immediate challenges and potential problems that would plague his brief reign and provide ammunition for his enemies throughout the crisis that followed. The speed of the succession process, while politically necessary given the immediate threats facing the kingdom, provided ammunition for his enemies to claim that he had usurped the throne through a hasty coup rather than legitimate succession, making his position vulnerable to legal and moral challenges from rival claimants, who could argue that proper procedures had not been followed. The new king's first actions demonstrated his acute awareness of the multiple threats facing his kingdom and his determination to prepare England's defences for the invasions that were already being planned by his foreign rivals, who had made their intentions clear through diplomatic communications and military preparations. Within days of his coronation, Harold began mobilizing the kingdom's military resources, strengthening coastal fortifications, implementing enhanced early warning systems, and deploying the defensive strategies that would be crucial for England's survival during the challenging months ahead. Harold's brief reign was immediately overshadowed by the growing certainty that multiple invasions were being prepared by powerful enemies who refused to recognize his legitimacy and were determined to press their own claims through military conquest rather than diplomatic negotiation or political compromise. The intelligence reports reaching the English court throughout the early months of 1066 painted an increasingly alarming picture of vast military preparations being conducted simultaneously in both Normandy and Norway, creating the nightmare scenario of coordinated attacks that would stretch English defensive resources beyond their limits and force Harold to choose between defending different regions of his kingdom. Duke William's preparations in Normandy represented the most immediate and obvious threat to Harold's throne, given the geographical proximity of the Norman territories and William's extensive political connections throughout northern France that provided him with access to military resources and diplomatic support. The Norman Duke had begun gathering men, ships, and supplies for his invasion almost immediately upon learning of Edward's death and Harold's coronation, demonstrating both his long-term planning and his absolute determination to press his claim, regardless of the costs or risks involved in mounting such an ambitious military enterprise. William's success in recruiting supporters for his enterprise demonstrated his formidable political skills and the effectiveness of his propaganda campaign, which portrayed Harold as an oath-breaking usurper who had violated sacred commitments and betrayed the trust placed in him by both divine and earthly authorities. The papal endorsement of William's cause provided crucial religious legitimacy that helped attract volunteers from across Catholic Europe, transforming what might have been seen as mere territorial aggression into a holy war sanctioned by the highest ecclesiastical authority and blessed by divine approval. The Norman invasion fleet that gradually assembled at various ports along the continental coast represented one of the largest and most sophisticated amphibious military operations attempted during the medieval period, requiring unprecedented coordination of logistics, transportation, and military planning across multiple regions and political jurisdictions. Contemporary sources suggest that William ultimately assembled nearly 700 ships of various sizes, along with thousands of knights, infantry, archers, and support personnel necessary for a successful invasion and conquest of a defended kingdom with established military traditions and fortifications. Meanwhile, in the distant reaches of Norway, Harald Hardrada was conducting his own extensive preparations for an invasion that would approach England from an entirely different direction and create additional complications for Harold's defensive planning, while potentially coordinating with Norman attacks to maximize the pressure on English defensive resources. The Norwegian king's alliance with the exiled Tostig, Godwinson, provided him with valuable intelligence about English military capabilities and political weaknesses, while giving his expedition the appearance of supporting a legitimate English claimant, rather than pursuing naked foreign conquest for personal advantage. The prospect of facing simultaneous invasions from both north and south created an impossible strategic dilemma for Harold and his military advisors, as English resources were insufficient to maintain strong defenses in both regions while preserving adequate reserves for responding to whichever invasion materialized first or proved most threatening to the kingdom's survival. The geographical separation between the likely invasion points meant that forces committed to defending one region would be unable to respond quickly enough to counterattacks in the other, creating a strategic vulnerability that Harold's enemies were clearly planning to exploit for maximum advantage. Throughout the spring and summer of 1066, Harold maintained a massive military force along England's southern coast, anticipating that William's invasion would come first. and from the most obvious direction across the English Channel, where Norman forces could most easily be transported and supplied. This defensive strategy, while militarily logical, given the geography and the apparent preparations being made in Normandy, placed enormous strains on both the royal treasury and the broader English economy, as thousands of soldiers had to be fed, equipped, and paid while remaining in defensive positions for months without engaging in productive economic activity or contributing to the kingdom's wealth. The extended mobilization also created political tensions between the crown and the nobility, as earls and thanes were required to maintain their military obligations for far longer than traditional feudal duties typically demanded, straining the personal relationships and political agreements that formed the foundation of medieval governmental authority. The financial and social costs of prolonged military preparedness tested the loyalty and patience of Harold's supporters, while providing his domestic enemies with additional grounds for criticism and potential rebellion that could weaken his position at the worst possible moment. The arrival of Tostig's raiding force along England's southern coast in May 1066 provided a preliminary test of Harold's defensive preparations and revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his military organization, while demonstrating the continuing threat posed by the exiled earl's desire for revenge. Tostig's attacks, while relatively limited in scope compared to the major invasions that were being prepared, demonstrated his detailed knowledge of English coastal defenses and his ability to coordinate his actions with Harold's other enemies, suggesting that a broader and more dangerous conspiracy was already well advanced, and that the preliminary raids were designed to gather intelligence and test English responses. Harold's successful defense against Tostig's raids demonstrated his personal military competence and the effectiveness of his coastal defense system, but the effort required to repel these preliminary attacks further strained English resources and provided valuable intelligence to Harold's enemies about the kingdom's defensive capabilities, response times, and the deployment of military forces throughout the realm. The raids also served to maintain pressure on Harold's government and demonstrate to potential supporters that the new king faced serious challenges to his authority from multiple directions. The summer of 1066 passed in an atmosphere of mounting tension and uncertainty as Harold maintained his defensive positions while his enemies continued their preparations for invasions that seemed increasingly inevitable with each passing week. The psychological strain of prolonged anticipation began to affect both the king personally and his military forces, as months of preparation and waiting took their toll on morale and readiness, while the kingdom's resources were steadily depleted by the costs of maintaining large military forces in defensive positions for extended periods. By early September, the financial and logistical pressures of maintaining England's defensive mobilization had reached a critical point, forcing Harold to make the agonizing decision to dismiss much of his military force and allow soldiers to return to their homes. For the harvest season that was crucial for the kingdom's economic survival and food security, this decision, while practically necessary given the kingdom's limited resources and the economic requirements of agricultural society, created a dangerous window of vulnerability that his enemies would soon exploit with devastating effectiveness and perfect timing. The dismissal of Harold's southern defensive force on September 8, 1066, coincided almost exactly with the arrival of Harold Hardrada's invasion fleet off the coast of northern England, a timing that was likely more than mere coincidence and suggested coordination between Harold's enemies, or at least careful observation of English defensive preparations. The Norwegian invasion force, comprising an estimated 300 ships carrying perhaps 15,000 warriors, represented one of the largest Viking expeditions ever launched against England and posed an immediate and existential threat to Harold's throne and the independence of the English kingdom. The landing of Hardrada's forces in Yorkshire created the precise strategic nightmare that Harold had been dreading throughout his brief reign. A major enemy invasion that required immediate response, but occurred at the worst possible moment, when English defensive preparations were at their lowest ebb and the king's military resources were scattered across the kingdom rather than concentrated for effective resistance. The invasion also demonstrated the effectiveness of Tostig's intelligence and planning, as the timing and location of the Norwegian landing were perfectly calculated to maximize English vulnerabilities, while minimizing the kingdom's ability to respond effectively. Harold's response to the Norwegian invasion demonstrated both his exceptional personal courage and his remarkable capacity for rapid strategic decision-making under extreme pressure, qualities that had served him well throughout his political career and would prove crucial during the military crisis that now threatened to destroy everything he had worked to achieve. Rather than attempting to recall his dismissed southern forces and risk allowing Hardrada to consolidate his position in the north while building defensive works and gathering local support, Harold immediately began a forced march toward Yorkshire with whatever troops he could quickly assemble, gambling everything on his ability to defeat the Norwegian invasion before William could launch his own attack from Normandy. The march north represented one of the most extraordinary military achievements in English history, as Harold led his forces nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, covering an average of almost 50 miles per day across difficult terrain, while maintaining unit cohesion and combat readiness throughout the grueling journey. This remarkable feat of endurance and organization demonstrated Harold's exceptional leadership abilities and the loyalty and dedication of his personal followers, who willingly undertook such a punishing expedition in service to their king and their kingdom despite the physical demands and the uncertainty of the outcome. The Battle of Fulford on September 20, 1066, provided a devastating demonstration of the Norwegian invasion force's military capability and the serious threat it posed to English security and Harold's continued rule. The defeat of the northern English army under Earls Edwin and Mercar removed the only significant military force standing between Hardrada's army and the complete conquest of northern England, while the capture of York gave the invaders control over the region's most important strategic and economic center, and provided them with a secure base for further operations. The loss of York also had profound psychological and political implications, as the ancient capital of northern England represented not only strategic value but also symbolic significance for English resistance to foreign conquest. The city's surrender to Norwegian forces demonstrated the effectiveness of Hardrada's invasion strategy, while potentially encouraging other regions to submit rather than face similar military pressure and destruction. Harold's arrival in Yorkshire and his lightning advance toward the Norwegian position at Stamford Bridge caught Hardrada completely off guard and demonstrated the English king's tactical brilliance and his ability to achieve strategic surprise despite operating with inferior numbers and limited resources. The speed and audacity of Harold's approach prevented the Norwegian forces from consolidating their position and establishing the defensive works that would have made them nearly impossible to dislodge, while forcing them to fight on terms more favorable to English tactical capabilities and military organization. The element of surprise achieved by Harold's rapid march north represented a crucial tactical advantage that partially compensated for the English army's exhaustion and numerical inferiority, while demonstrating the value of aggressive leadership and decisive action in military crisis situations. Harold's willingness to take enormous risks by marching north with a relatively small force reflected both his confidence in his military abilities and his recognition that delay would only benefit his enemies by allowing them to strengthen their positions and potentially coordinate their attacks more effectively. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, represented both the pinnacle of Harold's military career and one of the most significant victories in Anglo-Saxon military history, demonstrating his exceptional capabilities as both a strategic planner and a battlefield commander, while eliminating one of the two major threats to his throne: the complete destruction of the Norwegian invasion force, including the deaths of both Harald Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson, removed the immediate threat from the north, while providing Harold with a crucial military victory that enhanced his reputation and demonstrated his ability to defend England against foreign invasion. The victory at Stamford Bridge was achieved through a combination of tactical surprise, superior battlefield leadership, and the exceptional fighting qualities of Harold's housecarls and professional soldiers, who proved themselves capable of defeating one of medieval Europe's most formidable military forces in direct combat. The battle also demonstrated the continued effectiveness of traditional Anglo-Saxon military methods when properly applied under skilled leadership, as Harold's infantry-based army successfully overcame Norwegian forces that included some of the most experienced warriors in the medieval world. However, the victory was achieved at enormous cost in both human casualties and military resources, as Harold's forces suffered heavy losses during the fierce fighting that characterized the battle and depleted the ranks of England's military elite at the worst possible moment. The cream of the English military establishment, including many of Harold's most experienced and loyal followers, were killed or wounded during the engagement, significantly weakening the king's ability to respond to future threats while reducing the quality and experience of the forces available for subsequent campaigns. More immediately dangerous was the devastating news that reached Harold just 3 days after his victory. William's invasion fleet had finally sailed from Normandy and landed on England's southern coast, while Harold and his army were committed to fighting in the distant north, creating the worst possible strategic situation for the English king. The timing of William's landing, whether planned or fortuitous, created a perfect storm of strategic disadvantage that would test Harold's military genius and personal determination to their absolute limits. The Norman landing at Pevensey on September 28, 1066, represented the culmination of months of careful preparation and strategic planning, as William's forces established themselves on English soil and began the conquest that would fundamentally transform English society and culture. The landing also demonstrated the effectiveness of Norman military organization and logistical capabilities, as the invasion force successfully transported thousands of men, horses, and supplies across the English Channel and established a secure beachhead for subsequent operations. William's choice of landing site reflected careful strategic planning, as Pevensey provided access to the English interior while offering defensive advantages and proximity to the likely direction of English counterattack. The Norman forces immediately began constructing fortifications and establishing supply lines, demonstrating their intention to maintain their position, regardless of English resistance, and their confidence in their ability to achieve ultimate victory through superior military organization and tactical innovation. The final march south to Hastings represented Harold's last desperate attempt to preserve his throne and maintain England's independence through decisive military action against an enemy that possessed significant advantages in cavalry, archery, and overall military organization. The army that accompanied him on this fateful journey was a shadow of the force he had commanded at the beginning of his reign. Depleted by casualties from Stamford Bridge, exhausted by constant campaigning across vast distances, and demoralized by the seemingly impossible strategic situation they faced against fresh and well-prepared Norman forces, Harold's decision to march directly to confront William, rather than withdrawing to gather additional forces, demonstrated both his personal courage and his recognition that delay would only benefit his enemy by allowing Norman forces to consolidate their position and potentially receive reinforcements from the continent. The choice reflected Harold's characteristically aggressive tactical instincts and his willingness to gamble everything on a single, decisive engagement that would determine the fate of England and the future of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The approach to Hastings also revealed Harold's understanding of the political dynamics of his situation, as prolonged conflict would likely encourage other potential claimants to enter the struggle, while demonstrating weakness that could undermine his support among the English nobility. By seeking immediate battle, Harold hoped to achieve a decisive victory that would eliminate the Norman threat and establish his authority beyond question. Though the risks of such a strategy were enormous, given the condition of his forces and the strength of his opponents, the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, would determine not only Harold's personal fate, but the entire future direction of English civilization, as the engagement between Harold's Anglo-Saxon forces and William's Norman army represented a clash between two fundamentally different military systems and cultural traditions. The outcome would determine whether England would remain an independent kingdom, preserving its ancient laws and customs, or become part of a continental empire that would transform its governmental institutions, social structure, and cultural identity beyond recognition. The battlefield itself reflected the strategic situation, as Harold's forces occupied a strong defensive position on Sandlock Hill that maximized their advantages in defensive warfare, while forcing the Normans to attack uphill against prepared positions. Harold's deployment of his forces in the traditional shield wall formation demonstrated his confidence in Anglo-Saxon military methods, while reflecting the limited tactical options available to an army composed primarily of infantry forces facing an enemy with significant cavalry and archery capabilities. The Norman army that approached the English positions represented the cutting edge of medieval military technology and tactical innovation, combining heavy cavalry, professional infantry, and skilled archers in a coordinated force that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining pressure on enemy forces. Through multiple attack methods, William's forces also possessed the crucial advantage of being fresh and well-rested. Having avoided the exhausting campaigns that had depleted Harold's army over the previous months of constant military activity, the battle itself unfolded over many hours of intense fighting, as both armies demonstrated exceptional courage and determination, while their commanders struggled to achieve decisive advantage through tactical innovation and personal leadership. Harold's forces initially held their ground successfully against repeated Norman attacks, demonstrating the continued effectiveness of traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive methods when properly applied by experienced and well-led troops. However, the prolonged fighting gradually wore down the English defenders, as casualties mounted and the shield wall began to weaken under the constant pressure of cavalry charges, archery bombardment, and infantry assaults that prevented rest or reorganization. The Norman ability to coordinate different types of forces and maintain sustained pressure eventually created opportunities for breakthrough that skilled tactical leadership could exploit for decisive advantage. Harold's death during the battle, struck down at the height of the fighting while defending his royal standard and inspiring his followers through personal example, marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of a new era in English history that would fundamentally transform every aspect of medieval English civilization. His heroic final stand, fighting to the last against overwhelming odds while refusing to abandon his responsibilities as king and military commander, provided a fitting conclusion to a remarkable life spent in service to his kingdom and his people. The king's death also triggered the collapse of organized English resistance, as the loss of royal leadership created confusion and demoralization that made continued coordinated defense impossible against an enemy that possessed the resources and organization necessary to exploit, break through, and pursue retreating forces. The Battle of Hastings thus became not merely a military defeat, but a civilizational transformation that would reshape English society, culture, and political development for centuries to come. Harold Godwinson's legacy extends far beyond his brief reign and tragic death, as his life and career embodied the highest ideals of Anglo-Saxon leadership, while demonstrating both the strengths and limitations of traditional English political and military institutions. His rise from nobleman's son to King of England reflected the opportunities for advancement that existed within Anglo-Saxon society, while his ultimate defeat illustrated the challenges faced by even the most capable leaders when confronted with coordinated foreign invasion and the technological and organizational advantages possessed by continental military forces. The last Saxon king's story serves as a bridge between the ancient world of Anglo-Saxon England and the new Norman order that would transform medieval European civilization, representing both the end of one era and the beginning of another in the long history of English political and cultural development. His heroic resistance to foreign conquest and his willingness to sacrifice everything in defense of English independence established him as a symbol of national resistance that would inspire later generations of English leaders facing similar challenges to their kingdom's sovereignty and cultural identity. And so ends the tale of Harold Godwinson, the last Saxon king, whose brief but eventful reign encompassed some of the most dramatic and consequential events in all of English history, from the heights of military triumph to the depths of tragic defeat, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the centuries and remind future generations of the courage, determination, and sacrifice required to defend one's homeland against those who would conquer and transform it beyond recognition. Harold Godwinson, the last Saxon king of England who died at Hastings,